the thing is, you have to lift up, right? Because like the trees are used to resisting sideways pressure. And so with the tree scoops, the thing they do is they pop them vertically because the entire tree is designed to like not get blown by the wind. So people try to pull sideways, you're never going to take enough force with anything short of like a excavator machine to pull them sideways. So with the tractor, one of the tricks is to and it's not safe, but people do all the time. It's like you have a big tractor wheel, right, and you have a chain link over the top of the wheel, all chain it around, dig out under some chain it under the pull up as the wheel turns. That sometimes works, depending on how the size of the tree. Yeah, exactly. Well, also like the thing to me is like, you really want to make it like a if a strap breaks or something snaps, like what's the value of your truck versus the tree? Right. Like, it can be as simple as like, oh, the chain pulls right away, it rips off the tailgate, or pulls out, ruins the spring or something. Yeah. All right, by my clock, it's 5:45. We will call the meeting to order. Jenny, can you do roll call?
Amy Riddle Swanson,
Here.
Abe Smith,
Here.
Dominique Stewart,
Here.
Rachel Henderson, Dale Dahlke,
Here.
Amber Kirsting,
Here.
Emily Hines,
Here.
Michelle Dupree,
Here.
Angela Wolf.
All right, we have a quorum. Let's rise for the pledge of allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our mission statement: the school district of the Menominee area, by embracing the unique needs and using the strengths of our diverse community, is dedicated to preparing all students to become lifelong learners, caring individuals, and responsible citizens. Are there any requests to adjust the agenda? Okay, hearing none, let's move on. Recommendations and commendations, I think we have none tonight.
We have no formal accommodations, but I would like to just give a shout out to our students, staff members, and families who have been so active with all sorts of different opportunities for our kids. This week is amazing in terms of the number of activities. I know in the high school, there's a basketball game tonight, boys basketball tonight, Tuesday is girls basketball, Thursday is boys basketball, Friday is girls basketball, Saturday is the sectional wrestling meet, and that's not even counting the FBLA, and there was another one, forensics, this past weekend. I mean, it is just amazing to see how well our facility is being used, and it would not happen without our staff members and families who support those
I might add that
activities.
there is a Bandorama concert at the middle school tomorrow night.
Yes, thank you.
All 6th, 7th, and 8th grade band members, and from what I understand, they're playing the century, decades from the 50s through the 90s or something like that.
Yeah, it's really great.
And DECA and dance team. That's great to hear, and yeah, I just came from River Heights where we were doing all the 4th and 5th grade science Olympiad practice, so yeah, it's been a busy, great beginning of the spring is coming around the corner. Highland Youth.
So speaking of all those great activities, obviously there's a lot of great activities happening in the classroom as well. And presenting tonight's highlight on youth is Principal Keela Drought. Keela is the principal at Oaklawn Elementary. So yeah, go ahead and grab that microphone, Keela, and get it all set up. And
Here we go.
there you go.
Thanks. So starting with the high school, I brought some notes too, so I didn't forget. 16 students made it to stage for DECA, which is fantastic. They had first ever talent show, which was really great. And then I wanted to highlight the adaptive sports game. That I happened to be at that basketball game, and there was absolutely nothing like it that I've ever seen before. So that was between the girls and boys game, or at halftime of the girls game, and the students in the adaptive sports class played against the high school helping class. So it was really fantastic. Not in middle school, the 8th graders attended a musical up in the Twin Cities, and they also hosted a conference swim meet at Menominee High School. NAP had the Stout women's basketball team come, and it coincided with their basketball unit, so that was great. They had a chance to do that. They also sponsored a food drive. Oaklawn, we had our glow dance, and if you've ever seen 300 plus students and parents in a gym with glow necklaces and the lights out, that if you can picture that, it was a ton of fun. We had a huge turnout, lots and lots of people. And you know, we had a 2-week stretch of indoor recess, and 2 weeks except for one day, and I think we were indoors for 2 weeks. And so I just took a few pics of the kids doing all the things that they don't get to do because they're normally outside. So River Heights had some snowshoeing, and they also sponsored a book fair in accordance with their parent-teacher conferences. And then Wakanda, the Ranger Night, lots of great pictures in there of all the students and their national park projects. So, thanks.
And Abe, I almost forgot to mention, the swimming team held the conference swim meet on Saturday at the Menominee High School pool. So there were 8 teams, I think it was. It's all one big blur, because I was on the live stream from noon until about 4 o'clock. 39 different races. It was quite the event.
Great to hear, thank you. I think we don't actually have student communications tonight, right? Community communications, there haven't been any submitted. So maybe we'll move on to the revenue expenditures report.
Okay. So as usual, we'll start with the revenue report. The most significant change from last month is the January equalization aid payment, which was posted as scheduled. I also submitted a large grant claim in January, so that should be showing up probably in next month, if not the month after that, revenue report. Then looking at the expenditures by object, there is an increase. We did see an increase in utilities, of course, largely due to the colder than normal temperatures in late December, early January. We also might see some additional impact next month as those bills continue to post. Hopefully we'll have normalized temperatures so we don't see that trend continue. And then we kind of see the same thing from last month in the function report. You'll see the same pattern reflected in the gas and electricity portion of the budget, which increased about 7%. So these are just some of the changes that we saw from last month and a bit about what's driving them. Are there any questions?
One thing I would like to add, with the energy prices, our school district does a really good job helping to manage the cost of energy. Obviously, we try to conserve energy as well, but a couple things that we do is we have peak rate pricing for our electricity, and then we're also on a plan that can call for gas curtailments. And I think in my 12 years here, we may have had the gas curtailment maybe 2 or 3 times. We have never had it as long as we had it this year. It's over a week. And Steve Thomas, our energy manager, along with Kevin Tomaszewski, our director of building and grounds, they had to switch everything over from natural gas to propane. And by doing that, we were able to curtail our natural gas use. But by doing that and being part of that program, our cost and our billing remains at a lower rate for the balance of the year. So great job to those guys. Not only does it help the whole system, but it helps our district. And then, yeah, the peak energy, we got lucky we did not have school that day. Otherwise, it really would have been hard to maintain those low energy levels. But those guys did a good job and we were able to make it through.
Great, thanks. Any other questions or comments on the expense reports? All right, moving on, our next item is the monthly employment report. There is 1 hire and 2 resignations. Questions or comments? All right, next we have the consent agenda. On the consent agenda, we have minutes from January 12th and January 26th. We have general fund checks totaling $3,155,750.70. Cash receipts totaling $4,197,521.25. Among donations exceeding $1,000, there are several this month, which is great to see. $1,094.55 for sponsorships from various community members for the high school. $4,945 from various community groups to help school lunch balances. $3,470 from the Anne Marie Foundation through several grants applied to forensics, Wakana Elementary, Science Olympiad, the band, and $4,843.79 from the Community Foundation on teaching mini grants, which go across the district, across many different buildings. Entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda. So we'll,
Second, Nancy.
I think that was Dale and a second by Emily. Any other questions or comments on the consent agenda?
I just want to say that I am very much looking forward to seeing the Peace Path at Oaklawn, and I just think it's a wonderful thing to do in memory one of our staff members, so that is still so loved.
Thank you. Other questions or comments on this item? All right, let's go ahead and vote. Motion passes 7-0 for the consent agenda. Next, normally we have the personnel consent agenda, but I believe there is no resignations, retirements, or hires at this time on that agenda, so we'll move on to the discussion items. First discussion item, MHS course recommendations. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Just to tee this up, at the last school board meeting, the board reviewed the timeline that we have. We have a lot of big decisions coming up, like we do every year. We have our compensation plan, our staffing plan, our preliminary budget. A lot of it though is driven by student enrollment and driven by student course requests. So this is kind of the first step in a multi-step process that's gonna ultimately lead us to the final budget that will be presented to the board this summer and then brought to the community in August. But what Brian does is he works with Mr. Drake, the high school principal, and we start at the high school level in terms of looking at the course requests, the courses that the students sign up for, and then we try to build our staffing the best we can based on what our students need. So Brian, if you want to go ahead and share this year's information, that would be great.
Yep, thank you very much for the introduction. So what's before you this evening is our recommended courses that after review of the initial registration process and student course selection are courses that have a current selection or enrollment of less than 15 that based on discussion with departments and review by building level and district level administration, we are asking for approval to run with enrollments of less than 15, 15 being the minimum that we automatically will run courses. This year, we currently have 2 at the high school, AP Calculus AB, which is a 1 credit course that currently has an enrollment of 14. It is possible that that enrollment might grow. And then Advanced Theater, which is a semester course that currently has an enrollment of 13. For context, when we brought this forward last year, we had 6 courses that had enrollment of less than 15. So this is probably one of the lower number of courses with less than 15. I think a lot of that has to do with a thorough discussion on the part of staff with students as far as the registration process, as far as offerings. But again, at this point in time, we'd be recommending your consideration for approving this. This discussion this evening will come back at the next meeting for approval. But at this point, happy to answer any questions that you may have.
And if I could just add to that, the reason why we bring these forward is board policy 343.1 is the class size policy. And it says right in there that exceptions to the minimum of 15 for all classes can be made to the Board of Education. So that's what we do at this time each year. And like Brian said, generally our classes are more in the 20s, but there are some situations like the example Brian had tonight with AP Calculus where it's a little bit lower. But again, those numbers could change over the next 2 weeks, and we will give you a final list for your consideration in 2 weeks. Any questions from the board?
Were there, for some of those low-level courses that were suggested last year for less than 15, were they not offered this year? Is that why there's only 2 instead of 6?
So I would have to go back and look at the specific list again. I know that several of them had enrollments over 15. So computer science 1, for example, is one that a lot of years we bring forward. That one currently has an enrollment of over 15, so it's not on the list. In some cases, courses may run 1 year and not the next year. But if memory serves me correctly, then I can follow up if you'd like me to. But the majority of the courses that were on the list last year that we brought forward had enrollments above 15.
That's good, thank you.
And Brian, these courses that you're showing tonight are only the courses under 15 that are being recommended to run. There are other courses that had well less than 15 that are not being recommended to run, and we could get the board that list too if you'd like to see which courses are not being recommended to be run next year.
That might be interesting.
I think that would be interesting, and this isn't particularly urgent, but I think it'd also be interesting to know if there's courses which have repeatedly been at a lower number and have never been approved. Is there, if there's things that have been added, 8 or 10 people and have been consistently not put on the list, that maybe there's interest which is simmering but has never kind of reached the threshold. That would be very interesting to know in terms of student trends. I'm sure you keep track of that stuff, but I'd be just kind of curious if there's bubbling interest somewhere which we haven't been able to satisfy. Yeah, and we can pull that information together and get to it. Other questions or comments on the course recommendations for the high school? All right, let's move on to item 4B, discuss plans for the student device refresh.
So this is an item that typically would come to the board in terms of letting the board know that an RFP went out and that a request for the refresh was put together, and we would be recommending the board to approve a lease at the end of February. This year is very unique, however, and Katie can share more. I'll try to give you my interpretation of it. Because of some of the issues with supplies, specialized chips for the computers and such, the vendors that we are working with are saying that the fluctuation of their bids, they cannot lock in pricing, in some cases not even beyond about a week. Whereas typically we would have a 30-day price, and then that would give us enough time to put a lease together, because typically that's how we have financed our 6th through 12th grade student devices. Well, we could still do that, but if we demand a 30-day price, they certainly are going to price those devices at a level to make sure that they're not going to get caught. Well, when we start taking a look at our ability to finance, we're in a much different position now than we were, let's say, 10 years ago. And I know we've had a lot of discussion about the importance of our school district having a fund balance, and this is a perfect example of why having a fund balance is important. Because of our fiscal situation, instead of having to use a lease and spread the cost over 3 years, we do have the ability to make an outright purchase, which may be very financially advantageous to us in terms of getting a lower price. Katie, can you explain just a little bit about the RFP that's out there and then what we'll be looking for when those come in?
Sure, I was contacted by a few of the vendors that were concerned about being able to maintain pricing up until a payment. We can't sign anything to lock it in and say we're committed while we're waiting for the paperwork to come through. So we looked at a lot of options. So the original RFP was for the 3-year lease like we've typically done. After conversations with a few of them that were concerned about whether or not they'd be able to bid, I did release an addendum late last week that asked them to also provide if we were able to do a direct purchase. So those bids are due this week Thursday, and we'll kind of see what we get. But in conversations, it's all the manufacturers give the people we work with the pricing. Some manufacturer brands, are at 7 days. Some will do 21. Some can give us a better deal if we buy what's currently in stock, so they don't have to go back to the manufacturer for pricing. But it's just very volatile right now.
So, well, I guess what we're looking for is to see if any of the, any of the board members, if any of the board members have an objection to us using a direct purchase model, if we feel like that's the best way to finance our devices. Sometimes in the past, I would have been concerned about that because the nice thing about a lease is that you have that same price locked in for 3 years. So for budgeting purposes, it's really much easier just to have that 3-year payment. But again, with our fund balance the way it is, Also the fact that we are used to, planning. Our 30-year plan is the envy of really the whole state. And I'm very confident that we would be able to factor that into our budgeting process where it would not necessarily impact staffing or compensation or other decisions. Now, because of the way Wisconsin school funding has gone, and because of future budget concerns, I don't know that we'd be able to make the same recommendation 3 years from now, but I am confident that at this time, we can handle our own financing and not do a lease, especially if we can save on the upwards of $100,000 by paying it direct instead of over 3 years. But we wanted to ask the board members if you guys had any concerns or any direction you'd like to give on that.
Just to clarify, when you talk about, the 3-year lease model that you traditionally used, is it the case that it's rebid on a 3-year interval, or is it that there's a lease agreement which is some batch comes up every year over 3 years? Is it rolling over 3 years, or is it all at once, all devices?
For 612, it's all the devices, for both middle school and high school, every 3 years.
So you're basically saying that that there's a 3-year lifespan on the devices, we acquire them all, get them all set up, run them for 3 years, and then replace entirely.
This year we would, because a lot of elementary devices are also up, instead of purchasing elementary devices, a lot of those devices will be purposed at the elementary level.
They're gonna be less intensely used, okay, great, thanks.
I just have a clarification. So when you say,
Amy, could you speak in the?
okay, when you say that, that when you, do a direct purchase, does that mean that then we would own them and not be leasing them?
Yeah, and the way that we lease, we own them at the end, so then we can do a dollar buyout essentially, is the leasing model we typically go with. I would also anticipate this year, the interest on the loan or lease is a little bit higher than it has been. Not many would kind of give me their numbers, but prior to like releasing their bids, but it sounds like between like 6 and 8% where it's been, lower than that in the past. So for that reason, it might also be better to do outright right now.
Okay, thank you.
Would you anticipate in a purchasing situation that this would be a Fund 10 or Fund 46?
I think we would look at Fund 10. Fund 46 is a potential option because we're buying in a large batch. But something like this that isn't already in the 30-year plan, I think Fund 10 would be the most appropriate place for that.
Other questions or comments or ideas from the board?
Only a little bit related because reminding Amy to use I did this remotely 2 weeks ago, and with only 2 exceptions, it was really hard to hear everybody. So we all have to remember to use the microphone.
Thank you, Dale.
Would that make a difference with the insurance on the devices, or would that stay the same?
That price per unit cost for insurance would likely be the same. It would just, the only difference then would be the interest that you pay on that.
I'm not hearing, you asked kind of a question of would the board be willing to entertain this. I'm not hearing any objection to the idea of pursuing it as a financial possibility. Is that accurate? So my personal view, and I'm curious if everyone else agrees or disagrees, is that if we have the cash flow to maintain a purchasing model, and it does not, and that is the most effective way to get the devices that we need on the timeline that we need them, then it's worth investigating seriously as an option.
And just to make sure we're clear on the numbers, so our fund balance, Eric, hovers around 17 million, right?
Correct.
And the last time we did a cash flow analysis, we feel that we need at least 11 million in the fund balance to maintain proper cash flow. The ballpark over 3 years would be about $1 million, but again, it's very volatile, probably could change 10% either way. So I would say that we would be financing close to $1 million. So we do have the space. So really, what we would do then is see how the bids come in Thursday, and then depending on the pricing models, if the device that we feel is best and the best price, if we can have a 30-day, we still may consider the lease. With the interest rates, like Katie mentioned, I'm thinking a direct purchase still might be the best bet. But if, depending on the prices we get, if someone has them in stock, we're ready to pull the trigger, and then we would bring it to the board for your ratification at the next meeting in 2 weeks. But I think we would pull the trigger sooner if unless somebody has an objection to that.
Would we consider splitting it between two vendors, or do you always stick with one? If somebody had a significant amount in stock, and we could do that and direct purchase some, or is it?
The way manufacturers work with sales is usually one reseller gets far better pricing, right? It's like whoever reaches out to Lenovo first gets the best Lenovo price. Whoever reaches out to HP first gets that best price. So it would be unlikely that we would have a scenario like that, but it is possible, like if we're looking at what's in stock. Where it gets a little more complicated is when we're adding like some of the device insurance and warranty things, those things are not always equal, and that would be maybe a difficult cost of ownership.
Are there administrative and technical reasons for doing the full 3-year purchase at once? Or would it, if you move to a purchasing model, would it make sense to phase them on a year-by-year basis? Or would that just make your life too difficult in terms of maintenance?
I'll answer that, Katie. We do not want to divide it in 3 years. Yeah, the management of, what do you call it, mirroring or imaging, thank you, imaging all the devices and all that stuff. And then also the students, you know, it's not like all freshmen have all classes together, you know, so we really want to have consistency in the student experience.
Understood. Thank you. Any other questions or comments on that discussion item? All right, moving on to item 4C, discuss compensation for 26-27. Joe, do you want to summarize the state of play?
Yes, I'd be happy to, and this is very typical. Comes to the board in February, and it all starts really with the WERC, Wisconsin Employment Relations Commission. They track the consumer price index, and then essentially they certify a CPI multiplier for different contracts that have different time periods. Our contracts in our school district are from July 1st to June 30th. That's the fiscal year. So for the fiscal year that begins July 1st, 2026, the CPI amount that would be applied to those contracts is 2.63, and that's the 12-month rolling average of the CPI for the past 12 months. So what we have typically done in Menominee, and what many schools do, is you take your compensation dollars from the previous year, you multiply it by that index, in this case is the 2.63, and that tells you how much new dollars you would have in terms of compensation for the next year if the board approved a CPI inflationary increase. From there, because we have different groups, different employment classifications, we would then take each group, take their pot of compensation dollars, multiply it by the index, figure out how much new money is available for each classification. We would then apply those new dollars to all the steps and lane movements that were earned on the pay scales. And then if there are remaining dollars, those dollars would be applied to the entire scale. Eric and his team in the business office, also working with Sam in the HR department, they have done the calculations. And for our teachers, after everyone's steps would be paid and everyone would move on the scale, the entire scale would move an additional $473. So what that means is, depending on the size of the step that teachers earn, most teachers would see an increase between $973 and $1,973 for next school year. The same process is used for the hourly wage schedule, and there aren't as many steps in that schedule, but people who would earn a step would range, the hourly rates would range between $18.53 to $33.69. The total dollar increase would typically range from $1,573 to $1,872 for the people who earn the step. After being here a certain amount of time and having good performance, the people who have already received the steps would have a lower increase, $515 to $608. So that's kind of the summary of where things are if we base our compensation next year on the CPI. It's kind of complicated, I hope I explained that enough.
So just to be clear, so this is a discussion item tonight, and a compensation plan would come back for a vote at the next meeting in 2 weeks?
Correct, I would like to get feedback from the board, and see if the board still wants to use that CPI figure as the target. Once we establish the target, then we will update all of the pay schedules and contracts reflective of the target that the board sets. And then we would bring those back in 2 weeks.
So, questions, comments, suggestions from board members? Dale?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Joe has just spelled out to help me understand the typical way of applying that CPI. So hopefully you understood everything that he said that would be the typical way of doing it. I would like to propose a variation of that. And some districts use that, I think, as I understand, Eau Claire is one that uses a different application of the CPI. And I think some other ones do as well. And I would like to propose advancing all employees at their levels and lanes as appropriate, and then apply the 2.63, which is this year's CPI, to their compensation. Now it's going to be a cost to the district over and above the plan 2.63. My goals in doing this, there are several, but just to name a couple, would be an effort to maintain the high quality staff that we presently have. And I've heard over and over again how the principals and everybody is very happy with this staff, and I'd like to maintain them and have some longevity. But also, secondly, help us to compete with Eau Claire and Hudson, which coincidentally, based on the last, as you read from Joe's comments last week, from the superintendent's meeting, they are probably not going to advance very much, maybe CPI or less even. And that would be good, because that would kind of help us compete with them more favorably. Last year we tried that, and then Eau Claire went and boosted up above us, so it didn't accomplish much. I would also like to compensate our staff for their hard work, for their excessive education, and maybe most importantly, to motivate them to improve every day, every year, and to become better educators. And I think that this would be a really important step in that direction. And finally, this might be a good year to do it. It's a relatively low CPI. Some of you might remember, maybe I'm sure you remember some numbers as high as 8. This is relatively low. I don't think it's the same as my cost of living increase. If you look at housing and look at the computers that we just heard about, and you look at other things like insurance, I don't think that 2.63 is going to match that. So I think that this would be a really good time. I'd also like to point out, Joe talked about how typically it was applied. Those dollars that are remaining, that are added to really increase above the levels and the lanes, that's really pretty minimal. Am I correct, Joe? That's a pretty small dollar amount, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, a fair amount of the new dollars is spent on the steps. Yeah,
Yeah,
there isn't much remaining to add on to the scale. It's $473 for our teachers in each cell, once the steps are paid. Everyone who has good performance though also receives a step, which is somewhere between $500 and $1,500. Then the 473 would be added onto that.
yeah, and I think that that is valuable, and I wouldn't want to negate that or do away with it. I think that is an important point. And this is certainly going to cause an issue with some balance sheets and budgets and whatever, and I recognize that. I would not be in favor of it if it's going to diminish any of the great things that are being done and that we've approved on an annual basis. You know, staff cuts, that would eliminate my idea completely if that's what it meant. You know, that is not permissible in my mind. I had a compromise idea that was shared with me from somebody. It's just kind of a compromise if anybody thought that this was too much. But I recently looked into Act 10. Is that correct? Am I correct about that? Act 10 might not allow just let's say just to throw out a percentage, might not allow a 3% across the board increase. That would be over the CPI, and the way that Act 10 is written, it didn't sound like that would fly. So that's I've been thinking about this for a long time, but now is the time for me to share my ideas.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, I think, and again, this is a discussion item where we want to kind of generate ideas about what people think about compensation and what the different pros and cons are. Joe, you want to talk about the steps situation?
Can I ask a clarifying question first?
Yeah, of course.
Wait, you go first.
No,
You might answer.
I just wanted to make sure, I just want to make sure I understand, kind of clarifying as well. So first of all, Dale, so if I heard you correctly, what you're suggesting is that we pay the steps and lanes outside of the CPI, and then still apply the CPI to the pot of compensation dollars and add that amount to the scale. You're talking about adding that in even increments across the scale?
Yes, with the exception of what you mentioned about those that.
The steps and lanes, yeah, that would be outside. Okay,
You know, it would be similar to what we've done in the past with those who are like administration, who's a regular salary. They would get the CPI added to their compensation.
yeah, I don't think that's a good comparison because the administrators don't have steps and lanes, but I understand what you're saying. So then just to make sure everyone understands the numbers we're talking about. So the 2.63 would cost next year $653,563. So a little over $650,000. The step and lane movements are $353,479. So what Dale's suggesting is that the $353,479 for step and lanes, that gets paid first, and then the $653,563 is added onto that. So essentially it's an extra $353,000 is what we're talking about.
Thank you. Thank you, that explains it better than I.
And then, just a couple more points of clarification. Dale mentioned Act 10, and that is a consideration that we have to think about. However, Act 10 is specifically written for bargaining, and our staff members have chosen not to negotiate as a group. So the Act 10 limitations do not apply. So another thing that you or the board could consider is if it's the 2.63 that you're concerned with and you wanted to go, let's say, to 3%, you could do that and go beyond CPI without having to just you're not limited to only paying the steps and lanes outside of the CPI. We did cost that out. For every 1%, it's $242,888. So for instance, if the board said we want to do 3.63 instead of 2.63 and use the same costing mechanism that we typically use, it would cost $242,888.
So we've gotten very much into the weeds. I want to make a more general comment myself from my own perspective. I think, and Dale alluded to this, I feel like the 2.63 is, I think in my own life, expenses have gone up significantly more than that this year. That does not feel to me like a lived number. Now, I don't have the statewide statistics other than what that the WRC provides, but the 2.63, several years ago it was 8.5, it was 4.5, last year it was 2.95 or something like that. 2.63, that does not feel accurate to me as an individual living in the economy. It feels like the number is for whatever reason of how they compute it or how things work out or our area versus statewide, I don't know. That feels unrealistically low to me personally. I also think the things you said, Dale, about valuing our staff and making sure we continue to be not only stabilizing our staff economically, but also attracting staff from nearby areas and being a competitive employer is deeply important. We talked before about we have a fairly young staff right now and we want to keep them here, make sure they don't end up hopping somewhere else. So I think that those ideas of how can we make sure our staff are well compensated, and I think we've tried to maintain CPI, and even in the years when CPI was high, and I think that this year, to me, this number is low, and to me it feels absurdly low in a sense. I don't know how much higher feels right. I am curious though, you mentioned the steps versus the CPI. Something like that was done, I want to say 5 years ago, right? I wasn't on the board at the time. I think I was just before we joined the board. Amy remembers. I'm curious what something like that would mean from the HR perspective in terms of like, what are the steps and how do they play out in terms of how people feel in terms of promotions and fair comparisons between positions and all those other issues that come from comparative compensation.
I'll answer that and then Sam can add in if she has more. Yes, you're right. I think it was 5 years ago. That was one of the years the CPI was high, but it was also coming off of the peak of the pandemic when it was really, really difficult to be in our schools, be in all schools. At that time, the board decided to pay the CPI on top of the steps, which again is like an extra little over 2%. So it has been done before, and like Dale mentioned, some other school districts have used that practice before. From the HR perspective, last time the board decided to do that, the board applied the CPI percentage across all the cells in the pay scale. I really would prefer not to do it that way because it creates inequities within the cells, especially since we're talking about a group classification of everyone being a teacher or everyone being an hourly employee for their whole group. If the board wants to go beyond the CPI, and I love the idea of paying our people more. I think it's great. I'm not sure we can afford it, but I love the more we can pay, the better. It's easier for recruiting and retaining for sure. But, if you do it on a percentage basis, you're creating larger gaps between the different steps. So I would much rather give the steps and lanes, still take the same number of dollars, but spread them across the scale evenly, so we're not creating wider gaps in our pay system.
I have another question for Dale, but I'm curious if other people have questions or comments about these ideas.
I'm just spinning this all through my head, so Joe, if I recall correctly, and I'm understanding what you're saying, the 2.63, you're saying take all of the, what of the staff mix and it's one amount that's averaged? Is it average? So that not like the highest paid, say teacher Z that's at the highest pay scale, 2.63 of that particular person's salary will not be their raise.
Correct.
Okay, that's what I thought, I just wanted to make sure I was right.
Because, the pay scale really, there's a dramatic difference between the beginning and the end. And if you do it on a flat percentage, there is a huge difference between a teacher at the beginning of their career and what their raise would be compared to a teacher towards the end of their career and what their raise would be.
Yeah, I think, yes, I understand that, and I don't disagree with that. I just think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what that 2.63 or whatever percent we're giving, what that means. Like 8% that year didn't mean 8% for every single teacher at where they are.
That year it did.
It did that year, okay, because the rule changed.
Because the steps,
Okay.
because the steps and lanes were paid outside of the
Okay.
CPI.
And is that, Dale, is that what you're proposing right now, when you say the steps and lanes being paid outside of CPI? Like the year the 8% was done?
So my understanding of what Dale said, and correct me if I'm wrong, was Dale wanted to pay the steps and lanes outside of CPI, but then the CPI new dollars would be applied evenly across the scale instead of on a percentage basis. Is that correct, Dale?
That is correct, and, I feel that these steps and lanes are earned, they're earned through either education that they've received or longevity, and that's why I think the 2.63 should be in addition to that, to show the cost of living increase.
And I think that's a reasonable argument, I really do. Because, the CPI is supposed to be an inflationary marker, but if it's used to pay the steps and lanes, which are really more of a performance-based measure, it's not necessarily inflationary based. So I definitely appreciate the argument, for sure. And like I said, I love the idea of paying our people. But I do think the board needs to be cautious. And like I shared with you, and like Dale shared in talking to our neighboring schools, there are several schools that are looking at freezes, hiring freezes, in some cases even reducing staff. I think some schools are gonna be providing only steps and lanes, no inflationary index. We're in a really good situation in Menominee because we've already dealt with the health insurance crisis that everyone in this area is facing. So to Abe's point about, does it feel, does this inflationary index feel like it's a lived experience? At least in our case, whatever the board does will really be felt in terms of take-home dollars. I mean, I'm sure Michelle can remember years ago, and other, Dale, I'm sure you can remember years ago, where essentially the entire inflationary increase was used to pay for health insurance. Well, our premiums are not going up. That doesn't mean that our health insurance is not expensive and difficult for employees to be able to pay. I'm very pleased with the wellness incentive that the board approved last meeting. So again, I think we're doing a lot of things to provide our staff members with additional compensation that actually is take-home pay or can be applied to their health insurance. But just a couple more things, and I don't want to monopolize this, but I just want to make sure everyone understands these very important parts. So I do think we are looking at a deficit for next school year. without this. So I think anything that we add on is gonna add to the deficit. And I know the board, has committed to maintaining staff and maintaining programming, even if it means continuing to spend down the fund balance for a little bit. But these are recurring expenses. Okay, so when we talk about increasing salaries, it's not only gonna increase this year, but it's gonna increase then, that increase will be there next year. And then if you give out any raises next year, it compounds. So we're talking about recurring compounding expenses. And when we start looking at deficits and we think about what's gonna happen with state funding, that space that we have in our fund balance right now will go very quickly. So again, I'm not opposed to the idea, I love paying our people, but these kinds of decisions will make other decisions in the future much more complicated.
Joe, can you please repeat for me, you said for every 1%, what was the,
And I did put it in your background, and it's kind of hidden on the very bottom, Michelle, but I'll still repeat it. For every 1%, we're estimating it's gonna cost $242,888.
And that's 1%, well, that's essentially 1% in the current model, right? And this is a straight percent, not accounting for steps separately. And it would be the same other case, other ways.
It's 1% on the total compensation from this year equals those dollars, whether they're applied to steps, lanes, or inflation, or percentage, or flat dollar amount.
Okay, I have some questions. Mostly I'm just trying to sort this out in my head, and I think because I thought I understood, and then I was very clear that I did not understand. And then I think I understand a little bit. So the original recommendation is that we move each teacher up a step, which is normal, I think, right? Okay. And then that increase is the 426,000? No, that's 308,000. That's how much it costs to move everybody up.
The cost of the steps is $353,479. That's on the bottom, where I wrote if the board wanted to pay for the steps, lane movements in addition to the CPI, it would add $353. Yeah.
Okay, but
That's,
on the
that's
other
the, that's the
document,
cost of the steps and lanes, I believe.
without CPI, it's, I guess I'm looking in the Google Doc.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dominique. Thank you for pointing that out. That Google Doc from back in January, was, I think that is just for teachers.
So the recommendation is to move everybody up in steps and then spread out the CPI increase across where they are on the steps at that point. And now I need you to use as few words as possible to explain what Dale's idea is
Okay,
in comparison to this.
so again, I'm gonna go through it and I'll highlight when I get to that point.
Yeah.
So the dollars, for the recommendation, we would spend $653,563. Of that $653,353 would be spent on steps and lanes. The remainder would then be spread evenly across the pay scales, which would result in all pay scale numbers increasing by $473, and all hourly wages increasing 38 cents per hour after the steps and lanes. Did that answer it?
That was yours?
That was the recommendation.
Yeah.
Sorry. What Dale is suggesting is paying for the steps and lanes, the $353,479 first. then taking the whole $653,563 and adding that amount to all the steps in the hourly and teacher schedules. So ballparking it, it's not quite double, but it's about double. So it'd be like $940 for each cell in the teacher scale. It'd be about 76 cents per hour on the hourly scale. That's ballparking it. I'd have to actually calculate it. Dale's idea would cost an extra $353,479.
There's kind of a third category of option, which is to use the original structure of take a CPI number, pay for steps using that, and then take the remainder and distribute it evenly across everyone. But simply make the percentage higher, right? So that could also be discussed if, and Joe mentioned like the hypothetical, if we want to say 3.63 instead of 2.63, can I use the original structure of the pay, but simply take the percentage number higher? So, yeah.
So for instance, and again, I apologize for all the numbers, but the 2.63%, if we did the recommendation, that would cost $653,563. If the board said, instead of 2.63%, let's do 3.63%, that would be the $653,563 plus $242,888. It'd be about $111,000 less than what Dale said.
Thank you. I think I'm on the same page.
And the only reason I didn't suggest what Joe just outlined, like with a little bit higher than the CPI, is just for consistency, you know, the district has gone with CPI, so let's use the CPI, but apply it a little differently. Joe, I had a question too. So you talked about the hourly and the teaching staff. How does that apply to others, administration, for instance?
Like the question you had before about steps and lanes, the administrators do not have any steps and lanes. So generally, the practice of Menominee has been to apply the, whatever percentage the board agrees upon, just apply that directly to the contracts.
So they also, with what I'm proposing, would get 2.63% on their,
What, I think what you were proposing was probably about a 4%. If you're proposing paying the steps and lanes and the CPI, if doing them both would probably come out to about 4%.
But that's
Except-
also a number that I believe we've chosen, like we could choose or edit.
Yes.
The difference, though, between those two is that the administrators, that whatever that percent that is decided on, each administrator gets that percent of their own salary, correct?
Correct.
And that's the big difference between how the percent's applied.
Yeah, it is very, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Which in my mind, the administrators are usually much higher paid because of their education and what they do. And so that percentage sometimes can look a lot different for them than it does for teachers. You know, because there's a big gap between teacher salary and an administrator salary, which it needs to be in most cases. But what I'm saying is, if you give them that percentage, it's not like they're losing anything where teachers may have more difficulty with a smaller pay raise, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
One thing I wanted to mention, and I'm extremely conscious of the budget impact of these choices. I'm also very conscious of the fact that this is a Fund 10 question, and at the end of the year, excess in Fund 10 ends up in Fund 46, if there is any. And I remember very distinctly last summer, being surprised at how much of a surplus was able to move into Fund 46, which was very important to do, and it was the right choice. But a lot of the discussion at the time was, wow, I wish we had known we would have had this buffer and could have invested that back into classrooms. And I think it's exactly the sort of point where we are actually able to make that choice. And we don't know how close to the red or the black we're gonna be exactly when we get to July. But I am very conscious also of Fund 46 rapidly evaporating, along with our fund balance. But I do think this is one of those points where we can actively choose to invest in the staff in the classrooms in a way that has, direct impact on our staffing, and the well-being of our teachers. And so whatever model we come up with, I think, this is a decision I wish I had put more thought into a year ago in a similar situation, so that we would have had maybe a slightly smaller investment in Fund 46 at the end of the year, but would have had another year of teachers being paid a more competitive salary. So I just want to kind of make that comparison about the end of year balance.
And I think that's a really good thing to bring up, and now's the perfect time to talk about it. I will say that you're right, last year's budget ended up much better than the projection. Like we explained, a lot of that had to do with what we did with health insurance. And that's really the biggest reason why we were able to carry that forward, and actually we just, the incentive the board approved last meeting was, I think it was $800,000, does that sound right? I think it was around $800,000 that is going back to staff and wellness incentives this year. So that was something that we did along those similar lines. I will say that, looking at our budget projections over the long term, and again, we're talking like $40 million budget, so it doesn't take much to, 1% can have a real big impact. And Eric's done a really good job getting our budget closer and closer from projected to actual. With Downsville School closing, that really pushed our deficit situation out another year. I would have projected that we would have had a deficit last year, but again, with the insurance fixes that we did, that really fixed last year. Because of the incentives we just did, I'm not anticipating that we're going to have that same windfall from insurance this year. Downsville closing, however, did reduce some expenses, and I think that really should put us in a situation where we probably will balance the budget this year. Now, I'm not confident enough to tell you that we're going to have $3 million or even $1 million to spend, but I do think we will finish close to even or maybe slightly in the black. But when we talk about next year, if I was a betting person, which I am sometimes, the Super Bowl, I would bet that we will be in the red in next year. Yeah, because, and also the state budget was a whole other piece to that. So we know what the state budget is right now. We know next year's funding is gonna go up $325 a student, but that's about it. So, and the other piece is enrollment. As enrollment continues to decline, our revenue is directly tied to enrollment. Now, we do have a 3-year average, so it softens the blow a little bit. But in our director's meeting today, we were looking at it, and how many students were we talking about today?
78.
So we're looking at, between 75 and 80 students right now that we're projecting to be lower next year. Well, how much per student, Eric?
About 11,000, 11,500.
Okay, so we're almost looking at $1 million of revenue short next year compared to this year. So,
Another item too to consider is the reimbursement, the special ed reimbursement, which has come in way lower than promised by the state as well.
I was just gonna say that. Thank you, Eric.
so again, it feels counterintuitive because all of us here, the whole administrative team, our lives would be a lot easier if we paid top dollar. And we do wanna have the best staff possible. Recruiting and retaining is so important. But like I said, these decisions, especially when we're looking at future deficits, can make other decisions much more difficult a year or two down the line.
I have some more questions. Dale's, question about admin contracts, prompted this question. So, my assumption is this, based on whatever recommendations we have, this comes back next meeting for us to vote on?
Yes, that would be the plan.
And when it comes back, will that include admin contracts?
Yes.
Cause I feel like that piece of it kind of is missing a little bit from here. And so it might be prudent to kind of, to separate those out and have that come back later, if possible, unless we have like a specific plan that we come up with today for that. Because I think we have identified that the way that we're considering, impacting one scale is not, it's kind of apples and oranges, it functions differently. So that's one of my first thoughts. But you answered my question that this is coming back. Now, not to switch lanes here, but I did have another question in part of the compensation recommendations, in bullet 2. I have just had a little confusion about the wellness incentive. So this is sort of like repeating the one-time deal we did this year, right?
No, I should have clarified in the background. The attachment you're looking at, Dominique, is really just a summary of the discussions that we had with the teacher compensation committee. Those are not the recommendations that we're necessarily recommending to the board tonight. So the item you're talking about.
I just didn't even be looking at that.
Yeah,
Great.
it's really just background, but the item you're talking about, that's already done. It's not on there as a continuation, that's what the board approved at the last meeting.
Oh, okay, thank you. For the one we just did,
Yes,
okay.
yeah, and I,
Is that happening next year?
no,
Got it.
no, and like I said, I should have clarified that more, that this was just informational.
Great. That clears up a lot of things.
But I think that, but I also think it's really important, I'm really glad you brought that up though, because there's two other things, and that is partly why we wanted to share. In addition to the salary scale recommendations, you will notice in the teacher summary, we did also work with the committee, we also talked to the QIC group last week about creating a new incentive for unused paid leave beyond the maximum accrual. And that is something that we will be bringing forward when we bring forward handbook recommendations for the employee handbook. And that would start beginning on July 1st, so starting next school year, where people would be paid out for their paid leave that they do not use. So that would be another compensation item. We value it about $30,000. But I also want to point out number 4, and the board is well aware of this, with the climate around staffing so much different now for public schools than it ever was, it really is more of a free agency market, especially with teachers in hard to hire areas like tech ed, special ed, and some of the higher level maths and chemistry. Those are just a few examples. Special education would be another one. We're seeing more and more teachers go from district to district and getting different offers. And how we deal with that individual bargaining component is something that we've been talking with our staff for, 3 years now on QIC. And we've talked about performance incentives, we've talked about performance pay altogether and getting rid of the salary scale. But all of that has not been agreed upon. In fact, if anything, it's solidified the importance of having a salary scale, and everyone, including the administrative team, has said along the way that keeping the integrity of our pay scale is the #1 priority. We still do have to deal with these individual situations, and we are dealing with them. But Sam and the HR department and the administrative team, we're still working on some sort of flow chart or some sort of process. But we don't expect to have some sort of performance incentive. We don't think that's gonna be coming forward.
When those kind of individual negotiations happen with new hires in high demand areas, is that typically a discussion of like which step level is most appropriate in terms of, well, maybe this experience counts as contribution to a step, or is there something happening outside of that step system?
I'll ask Sam to speak to that, because I think it really comes down to either placement on the scale or hiring bonuses or incentives,
Right,
Sam?
yeah, so we'll, in an effort to try to kind of keep things fair and equal as much as possible, we look at experience, we look at what they're currently making, because a lot of times that's also a factor in their decision to, to come to us, is whether or not we can meet them with what they're currently making. Oftentimes, in the last couple of, I shouldn't say oftentimes, but with these hard to fill positions, what I have done is like a signing bonus, for instance. And so that's a one-time payment that happens with their first paycheck. And then there's a contract that they sign that will have them stay with us, or if they leave, then they have to pay back incrementally that signing bonus. And that has, I think, has been successful for us in being able to recruit, some of those hard to fill positions.
But I do think that's something else the board needs to consider as you think about the overall scale adjustments, is right now we do not have a budget for specific retention bonuses. And that is something we have talked about, does it make sense to budget, maybe $50,000 or something like that, so that Sam and the HR department has the ability to make those adjustments when needed, because right now the adjustments are quite limited, and almost all the adjustments that have been made have either been because someone has gotten an offer to go somewhere else, and we've tried to match that offer to keep them, or they have taken on additional duties where they may have a change in their title, a change in their responsibility. But I do think that's going to continue to be a challenge, and something that eventually we're going to have to address with some sort of budget.
What's the protocol now? I know what it was when I was hired, because I came from a different state with years of experience, but, so right now, step-wise, when someone's hired, how do you decide the number of years accredited from having the experience, when they come from elsewhere?
Sam, before you answer, I want to point out, probably the biggest change from before, Michelle, is that the salary scale used to be based on years of experience. It's no longer based solely on years, it's based on actually on levels. And level placement, I think, is what you're asking, Sam. How do you determine level placement?
Mostly, like I said, we look at what they're currently making and wanting to make sure that they, are making what they're currently making, slightly more potentially, again, depending on the nature of the position.
And we do try to prioritize hiring teachers that have a good resume with good experience whenever possible. So because of that, oftentimes they have been working somewhere for anywhere between 5 and in some case 20 years. So placing them on a level can be really tricky, especially if they're coming from, like maybe the Twin Cities or something like that, where the salary scales are much different. So we've had to place them on levels that would be well beyond their number of years in some cases. But actually, we're even seeing new graduates that are coming out that are being advised by their colleges that when they, I'm not ripping on the colleges, but they're being advised, when you go, don't just accept a contract at the starting scale, especially if you're in a hard to find position like special ed or the ones I mentioned, they are negotiating for a level above the starting pay. So it's quite tricky.
I think Dale or Amy had a comment earlier.
So, when you and Sam, outlined the need to, compensate under certain special conditions, I think that should be budgeted, and I wouldn't want my idea to affect that in any way, because I think that's really an important thing that is done right now, to mean that high quality staff, and again, I'll emphasize what I already said, and that is, I wouldn't want this increase to have any negative effects on anything, including, staffing. And, I know that maybe be a easy way to level it all out, but that would not settle well with me.
Well, to counter your argument with your own argument, Dale, I think you made a very important moral point at the beginning about steps is something earned for work experience and performance. And that I think I have definitely heard from people over the years, every year this comes up, like, you know, someone would say like, you know, I was working toward my next step and it just got, you know, like washed through CPI, and people often don't feel they're really getting that kind of pay promotion based on performance. It just kind of gets washed out. And I think there is something, you know, even if the dollar amount isn't that different necessarily, there is something I think about the sense of reward for good performance and experience that is a valuable thing to note. And you know, of course, every decision that everyone makes, especially a body like this one, has both pros and cons, and so there will be downsides to every decision, of course. So next time we have a meeting, we will need an agenda item on the action agenda to discuss and vote on some sort of payment plan. And I'm wondering how to assemble that based on the things that have been discussed tonight in a way that's productive. I think there have been basically three branches of ideas discussed. One is the CPI as written and recommended, as it's quote always been, at least with a few exceptions. One is to take the same structure, but just manually tweak the CPI number by some arbitrary amount. And Dale, you expressed that you think that seems kind of arbitrary. And then the third is what Dale laid out, which is taking the steps compensation as one increase to the budget item on salary and wages, and another on CPI, and basically computing them separately, still doing the CPIs and across the board even distribution across different pay scales, but having the steps be different than that distribution of CPI. I am tempted to ask, and you basically already have this written up here, but like a full breakdown of all three of those, so everyone has time to read through them and think about it. I'm not quite sure how to structure the action item though with three different options in a way that would be productive. So I'm curious if people on the board members of the board have any suggestions on how we could proceed to discuss pros and cons if this were to come up again.
I don't necessarily have a solution to that, but I would like to say that I really like the idea of the option that is not Dale's and that was recommended, but the other one where it's, I think it's $111,000 more, where they raise the CPI, like 4% or whatever. That, to me, that's a good compromise.
Just to clarify the numbers there, let me pull it back up. So a change of 1% to the change of 1% to the compensation plan is $242,888 just across the board. So if I think the number was, Joe mentioned the hypothetical number went from 2.63 to 2.63, just adding a percentage point to it. And there's other, once we decide to change that number arbitrarily, there's not really, other than practicality, there's not really a bound on that. But yeah, that was each 1% change to that compensation plan is $242,888.
But the difference, I think Joe said, the difference between that and the one that he came up with first is $111,000, which it would have been 600,000 something otherwise. So what I'm saying is, to me, that's a good compromise.
I think one of the questions is the change that Dale's recommending about changing the steps versus CPI, I imagine when you express it, Dale, you're thinking of that as like a permanent structural change, right? As a way to say like, or is that just this year and every year's different?
I would say just this year, based on the fact that this is the lowest CPI year, and just to clarify, what Amy just said, it would be the difference between, mine would be, like Joe said, 353,000 plus additional, and if we went 1%, like you suggested, it would be 242, so it would be a difference of $112,000 difference between just giving them 1% additional CPI.
I have a thought about maybe narrowing things down. Where I'm at is I'm very open to Dale's idea. I'm also open to more of a compromise. So for me, the initial one is more off the table. So I think maybe that is a place to start, is like, are there 3 options, or are we all leaning towards 2? Or are we all really towards 3?
I wonder if we could structure it by talking about, excuse me, if we want to pay for the step and lane movements outside of CPI first, and deciding a yes or no on that. And then have the discussion about what the actual percentage should be.
So separate the structural question from the numerical question.
And having them in that order would change the second one, right? Or could potentially.
So hypothetically, if we were to structure it as, what is the structure of the compensation distribution of steps versus the CPI increase, and have that independent of the numerical question, it could end up being, hypothetically, I don't expect this would happen, that the percentage, the CPI increase would actually be lower than the state CPI, which some districts are, maybe are doing this anyway.
Could you say that again?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So, what Amber had recommended was if we ask the question first about should steps be paid before or after a percentage increase, and that's a structural question, and then have the question, what should the number be?
But they would all be over the CPI. They would still all be over the CPI.
I would expect so, yeah.
Or would you suggest paying the steps and lanes and then maybe no number?
No, I'm not recommending anything of that form. I was just saying that could be a potential outcome of a
We're
vote being
deep
structured
in
that
the
way.
theoretical weeds.
It's a theoretical weeds, yes, I apologize for that comment.
If it simplifies things, I mean, it's more work, but we could do it. We could provide the 3 options. I mean, if you think the board has it narrowed down to 3 options, which would be what's recommended, that'd be option 1. Option 2 would be what Dale originally talked about, paying for the steps outside of CPI, that'd be the second option. And then the one that Amy mentioned, kind of the compromise one, we could develop those 3 options and the board could debate those and vote on them next meeting if you'd like, unless you don't think you're at 3 options, and maybe that's what you were alluding to.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how do the options branch? Because to me, saying add a percent, it ends up being $111,000 cheaper. That's, and even though 1% is an arbitrary number, why not 1.2%, why not 0.9%, right? So, I think one question that I think is worth asking ourselves is, if we choose a number we are willing to spend on compensation increase, how should that number be distributed? So if it's the same, total, which I won't try to recompute, it's the same total amount either way, steps before or steps after, but we know what the number target is, then which of those would, board members prefer? That's along the lines of what Amber was saying, is ask the structural question, how should the payment plan be distributed, separate from how much money are we willing to spend on it?
I think that, in my mind, speaking totally from my own brain, that kind of complicates it. I think I would like to, even though it's extra work for your staff, I guess I'd like to see the 3 ideas that have been suggested, just outline like you suggested.
The only thing I would say, and the way that I heard this, Amber, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to interpret things here, is that if the board tonight, like I think Abe, you classified it as like a moral, or like when you said something about Dale having a moral, whatever. I mean, if the board feels that that the CPI should be on top of the steps and lanes or separate from the steps and lanes, then the question's already answered. And then there's no sense doing the compromise one, because that's not paying the steps and lanes outside the CPI, right?
Well, wouldn't it just be dipping into the CPI pot to cover a portion of the steps in the compromise?
It would be, but the,
So it's, can I try to sum it up and see if, so I'm imagining there is an increase based on the steps and longevity, and that is coming for all of the people who have earned that. And so the question is whether that earned piece comes out of the everything's more expensive, here's a CPI number to try and sum that pot, right? Or whether that happens and then this pot exists at whatever percentage. We either stick with what's federally set because that feels less arbitrary, or we say, yeah, we've got a little wiggle room, let's think about it. But I feel like the biggest questions if we're gonna do those steps outside of CPI. So that's the one that, like, when we get the option to vote, it's not like we're picking the one out of 3 that looks best, it's gonna be a yes or a no. So in terms of how we're structuring that, I feel like that piece needs to come up and we decide that piece before the number piece, which is shaped by that decision, is how I was imagining it and trying to see it with words.
So are you saying like, it might be more helpful to see what it looks like if everybody has their steps, and then we had a CPI of 2%, and then a CPI of 2.63, and a CPI of 3%, versus something else? Like, instead of having like the 3 things we've talked about, if we've all decided we really should do the steps and then a CPI, dive into what the different CPI percentages look like on top of the stuff.
I think the board would have a difficult time saying that the steps and lanes are earned, so they're separate from the CPI, but we're not gonna give you the CPI. I don't think that's a good option.
Exactly.
I would just like to say, we have 2 board members that are absent tonight too, and that's something that maybe they're gonna tell you too. But Michelle and Emily have been kind of quiet, and I'm just wondering, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just wondering what everybody thinks about the compromise piece. I just thought that was a good idea, but that doesn't mean that it is the only idea. I'm just wondering.
Right now, where my brain is just thinking about actually seeing real numbers. I just want to see I'd like to see of the three options, what that actually financially looks like. I need dollars. And go from there.
So maybe it sounds, oh, I'm sorry. So let's, for the next meeting, have a full breakdown of the original proposal structure at 3.63, and the proposal as Dale outlined, where steps are made separately from the CPI. I think that information is already in here, it's just a little bit, kind of between the lines, right? So that should be pretty easy to break down. And, I suspect what's going to happen is that, based on the discussion I've heard tonight, that people are not particularly interested in just the proposal as currently written, and the discussion will end up being which of those two other options is the right balance of rewarding and fiscally responsible. So I suspect that if we list those three options and have a discussion with hopefully all 9 board members, and all the members out in front of us, we can reasonably quickly narrow down what we think is reasonable in that moment and be able to vote. Does that seem acceptable to people?
Well,
Well said.
I don't feel, it was, well said, I don't feel comfortable with suspecting that we're going to choose 2 over the original proposal.
Fair.
Because Eric might provide us with the impact that that would have, and we might say that no. And I might be the first one to say, because of that impact, my idea is wrong. So I don't think we should.
Indeed, thank you for that correction.
I think we should consider all 3.
Agreed.
Can I, for me, for the compromise idea, I like that best when I'm looking at the numbers, but in terms of, I never in my life say, let's not use feelings as a guide, but I think it's to keep the integrity of the pay things, to be able to clearly articulate why these numbers are chosen, and to make sure that there is something to go on in years to come, that's not just like, well, that didn't feel like enough that year because everything costs $1 billion. Like, I just wanna have it, I wanna have very solid reasons that I can point to for why we came up with that number. And for me, the compromise, even though I like the number better, just feels a little mushy in that piece. So maybe it won't after more discussion and more things fleshed out.
That's fair.
I would like to just make sure when this all happens that I request a color-coded chart created by Eric.
To Amber's point, and I know we're going long on this, but this is a really important thing. My recommendation is based on the numbers and worried about the future and worried about the finances, and that's what you guys pay me to do. But I actually think, like, so some of you think the CPI is low. I don't think it's low. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when the CPI was less than 1%. I think the CPI is going down. And I think this is gonna be seen as a high CPI in the years ahead. To that point, I actually think that from a structural, moral, whatever we wanna say, if the board is considering doing more than what we've done in the past, then I would recommend paying the steps and lanes separately and applying the CPI separately. Because that is a structure, if the CPI goes down to 0 or negative, that structure could still keep its integrity of maintaining the earned increases. And then whatever's happened with the economy is applied, good or bad. So from that standpoint, if we're looking at trying to create a process, standard operating procedure, whatever you want to call it, I think the best thing to do is Dale's original proposal, pay the steps and lanes, those are performance-based, they're earned, and then whatever the CPI is this year, and hopefully we would do the same thing in future years, that's what we would apply separate from the steps and lanes. That is the cleanest, most predictable way to budget and to plan for, and for our staff frankly, to plan for what their future compensation will be. So I'll change my recommendation. Even though it's gonna cost us money, and I am worried about the impact, but I'm also worried about the impact of not being able to recruit and retain staff.
I really liked saying that, Joe, that I appreciate that very much, because I think every one of us wants to see our staff well compensated for all the reasons that we've talked about this evening.
I don't know if there's, we had talked about the, administrative contracts. And if we're not gonna pull those out, which is fine, we'll do whatever everybody else wants. I would like to see in the background for it, like we sort of have information about the impacts of the teacher salary and also the hourly. I would like to see that included if we're also gonna vote on it in the same.
Absolutely, Dominic, we'll have each and every contract done, so you'll be able to see each and every salary. I would caution the board, and I get it, when you apply percentages to a larger amount, the increases are larger. But as important it is to recruit and retain terrific teachers and hourly employees, the board also has to realize there is a ton of competition for good administrators. And I know no one likes to talk about it, but you've all seen, I'll just take my position for instance. I'm not gonna put anybody else on the spot. But you've all seen the turnover in superintendents, okay? And I am well compensated and I very much appreciate it. But CPI also affects all of us, whether you have a high salary or a low salary. So I would caution the board to do things different with your administrative team.
I was tempted to do things differently, but then I kind of gave it some more thought and got some more advice, and I agree with what you just said wholeheartedly. And I can give you several examples of other districts' attempt to hire good administrators. It's been a brutal struggle.
And we see the savings, it comes back, that experience and that knowledge. We see that with our administrators, we see it with our teachers, and we also see it with the money that then gets spent in the community too. Like this has that ripple effect, so.
Not to mention the consistency of the team. When a team works well together, they stay together.
I just want to clarify too, I don't know if this follow-up is directly reflective of me asking for that information here, but like also it's literally not in here at all. So like, I want to make that clear too. I think sometimes people think that I would like to slash our administrative salaries. But I would just kind of like to be aware of what they're gonna be.
I think that's good. And in my opening remarks, I talked about one of my reasons was our high quality staff, and I failed to mention, even though I had it as a note, our high quality administration. And I think we want to keep that administrative team.
So based on this discussion, Joe, do you feel that you have what you need from us to know how to prepare a new recommendation for next meeting and what information the board would like to see on that background?
I think so. I do want to point out that one of the attachments, we call it the green sheet. And Dominique, no, my reply was not in response to thinking that you were trashing administration or anything like that. So I hope my response didn't make you feel that way. That's not what I intended. But the green sheet, that is the one that shows the breakdown. It shows the CPI, and then it shows how that CPI impacts the hourly groups, the directors, the advisors and coaches, the teachers, and the administration. So you can see the total dollars. There's so much in here though, I can understand where it doesn't pop, and maybe I should have gone through each attachment first before we spent all this time. But you can see the impact there in terms of administration, but the individual contracts will be included in the next board update. But then to Abe's question, do you still want me to do 3 scenarios, or do we wanna just do the scenario where it's steps, lanes, and then CPI applied? Cause I think there may be consensus.
I'm comfortable with just two based on the discussion we just had and the point you made personally. Unless anyone does wanna play out the 3.63. Is that a yes, you want to see it, or a yes, you agree only two?
I agree to the two, I just wanna see numbers. That's all I'm talking.
Okay, but which
Can you
two?
clarify the two, cause
Yeah.
you just said
So the-
3.63 in our definition.
Well, when I said two, I was thinking the proposal which was written here, this straight 2.63 with steps included in the 2.63 versus Dale's recommendation, which separates them. So it's the kind of current standing recommendation versus what Dale had suggested we discussed.
So that's one.
Well,
If I'm not mistaken, we have the numbers of what both of those options are.
we do, yes.
So then,
And we're not voting,
what are we asking for?
we're not voting tonight, but I think that we've asked many questions about what does this number mean, what does this number mean? So having that broken down side by side, I think would be very helpful. So we can, feel comfortable with Dale's question about what's the impact on other programs or needs.
But to Dominique's point, based off the board direction, we then will create the teacher salary scale, we will create the hourly pay scale, and then we'll have like 20 contracts that we have to create. So if we do two scenarios, we have to do all that twice, which we will do, but if we know that we're going to pay the steps and lanes outside of the CPI, then there's no need to do both, we could just do that one and bring that forward.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
But that's only if there's consensus that the board feels it important to pay the steps and lanes outside of the CPI. Because we will do both if that's what you want, if there's not consensus on it right now.
The reason I'm saying two, I think there is consensus, but I don't want this to be an implicit vote. I think we do need to have a vote. I think it is important to compare them so that we understand exactly what the budget impact is. So I appreciate that it is more work for you and Sam and Eric. I think all that work has actually already basically been implicitly written here, other than the individual contract piece. But I think that for us to make that decision responsibly, we do have to see it broken down exactly per pay scale and per the total budget impact, so that if we're gonna make that structural choice, we understand what the financial impact is.
Okay, no problem at all.
Any final remarks? It's a very important, it's maybe one of the most important topics we cover the entire year, so I'm glad we had spent the time to talk it through. Are there other questions or comments? Or should,
One quick final remark.
of course.
I just wanna say that, yeah, the whole reason I brought up the thing about, advocates and educator and the other steps, percent is just because the teacher one is applied differently. The 2.6 whatever is not a straight percent on each person's contract. That's what I was trying to say. I think you're all very valuable.
Okay, let's move on, if there's no objections, to item 4D, revisions to the Title I policy 342.2.
Well, the nice thing is this one is super short. It really is just a legal update.
Famous last word.
No, well, it's basically mandated, so, Brian, do you want to just point out what the change is?
So the state requires that we go through and take a look at our compliance with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Really what is being proposed is we have an existing policy that represents No Child Left Behind, and to be current with current requirements, that is no longer what the program is. It's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and we need to update policy. And as such, we took a look at model policy from the School Board Association, and to simplify things, we are recommending that at the next meeting, the board vote to retire the old policy and adopt a new policy.
Questions and comments from the board on the policy wording changes?
I just have a comment on the very first statement in an effort to help students master challenging curricula. I was just curious if we could perhaps add what Title I is, like closing the achievement gap for students that may be underserved, you know what I mean? Just instead of just kind of jumping into it, because I feel like we're helping all students with curriculum and academic standards, but specifically what Title I is used for.
We can take a look at getting that added and clarified. One thing I will point out, in our Title I buildings, or our schools where we do participate in programs, they are school-wide programs, so they do apply to all students individually.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Thanks. Let's move on then to item 4E, discuss voucher transparency plan and resolution. Maybe, I guess I can summarize this. So last time we discussed what it would mean to have a voucher transparency resolution here, and what how we would then think about how that interfaces with other municipalities. The first step there was to consider what a resolution might look like from the SDMA, which would then be worked on bringing it forth to other municipalities. Joe and his team had looked at several examples from Eau Claire, Green Bay, Superior, and Washburn, and built an example, a draft example sample resolution based on the one from Washburn. So I'm curious if board members have thoughts on what that resolution looks like, if there's things about it that seem that they fit our needs in the nominee versus not. Questions, thoughts? We're not voting in this tonight, of course, it's a discussion item, but if we could potentially vote on this as a agenda item at the next meeting, if we wanted to move it forward, so.
I was just curious the highlights. School.
Yeah, we were trying to make some decisions. The Washburn one, especially the Eau Claire one, really made a point in all of those clauses to call out private voucher, special education, and independent charter school payments. And if we wanted to tailor it to Menominee, I don't know that we would need to include independent charter school payments in all of those clauses up above. But I just thought, in case the board wanted to include those, I wanted to point those out. I don't think it's necessary.
I agree, I think that's logical.
So potentially we could look at this and then, kind of maybe, doctor it up, or, I don't mean doctor it, that's not a good word, but maybe edit it if we need to, or add or delete or whatever, and then we would have a chance to vote on it then.
I think if there's edits you think are necessary, if there's ones you know about now, we can discuss them now. Otherwise, if we could collect those so that they end up in a action item next time. If the board wants to move on this, then the normal procedure would be that this resolution would come back as an action item at the next meeting. And then based after that action item, if that action item were to pass, then there'd be setting up a plan to implement the proposal and bring it to the city and other municipalities. So if there's wording or edits that you think are recommended, this is probably a good time to discuss them, or share them with Joe and I guess Rachel. She'll be sharing the next meeting in preparation for that.
Okay, I don't have any edits, I think it's fine, but I just was wondering about the rest of us, so.
I would be in support of moving this forward at our next meeting for an action. Vote on it, all the words.
I like the rough draft.
Yes, thank you for putting us together. Laura, whoever did that.
I agree.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the work done on that.
Thank you to Washburn.
Yeah, I think this is really solid. The one thing that I was wondering about clarifying is in the last part, therefore be it resolved. Where where it says to include annually the amount of the levy that is for the purpose of capturing reduced, diverted, lost school aid. I wonder if, I feel like it could be argued that that amount is on there, it's just not on there listed separately. So I wonder if there is a turn of phrase besides including it that would clarify that what we are hoping for is a separate breakdown of that number.
So on that second page at the top, I read it as, to include annually on the property tax bills the amount that is for the purpose of capturing the state aid. So basically, that is kind of implicating a particular amount. And you're suggesting putting something like, listing the amount individually or as a line item, or using some phrase to clarify that something is
Clarifies
specified
that
precisely.
that number, which is now in total, would be broken out on there. I mean, and maybe they did that with the example, but if that is the meat of all of the whereas bits,
So you could insert an adverb like explicitly and individually or something along those lines.
yeah, I think there's just room for just a little, it might just be one word. That would just clarify that a little.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Please send me that word. I'll think about it, but if you have one in mind, that'd be great.
I probably do, but I think we used up all the words tonight. I'll send it tomorrow.
So sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Thank you, Amber.
I just wanted to point out that the reason that the Washburn served as such a good model is because they have such a tremendous school board.
Proud dad moment.
That's a joke.
So I gather based on the nods earlier that people are happy with this draft, but to make some minor wording changes and are interested in having it be an action item at the next meeting. Okay. With that, shall we move on to next meeting dates, board committees, and reports? February 23rd, special school board meeting in this room at 5:45. March 3rd, public school funding forum at the library in Eau Claire, the Thanks Library in Eau Claire at 6 p.m. March 9th, school board meeting here, 5:45 p.m. March 16th to 20th is spring break, no school. Looking forward to it. And March 23rd, special school board meeting, 5:45 p.m.
Abe, I just want to point out that in regards to that March 3rd public school funding presentation in Eau Claire, Rachel Henderson, the school board president here, is going to be one of the panelists. It's going to be Chad Trowbridge, the business manager from Chippewa Falls, Mike Johnson, the superintendent from Eau Claire, Chris Hambuck Boyle, which you all know from the Wisconsin Public Education Network, and then Rachel Henderson. So, and that's not just for school board members, that's for anybody in the community, school staff members, parents, community members, and there definitely was a clear point to make sure everyone in the community felt invited. So again, that's March 3rd, 6 p.m. at the Public Library in Eau Claire.
Wonderful. It looks like there's a poster with a link and QR code attached with more information, so if people want to share that out with their friends and colleagues.
I'm just curious to know if there's any, there will be a live stream of that.
Is that yes? All right, we got our live streamer of the community in the back, so it is, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Doug County.
There is gonna be a live stream.
That's what Steve said. All right, with that, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right, we stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.